The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
The big thing we want to know is just any kind of general do's or don'ts in like body language, touch, space, face, eye contact, stuff like that.
In interning and working in a prison in the past is usually anything that could hint to aggression. So, for example, things you and I probably wouldn't think about, but for example, clenching your fist while you walk, for instance. And that could be seen as I am getting ready to assault someone. And when in reality, maybe you and I, as regular civilians, if you will, we're not necessarily thinking that we're going to assault another person. However, because generally the environment that they're in is so scary, they are in high alert. They are in high alert. So one of the ways that they can inform whether or not it's time to run from an assault is looking at a person's body language, for example, walking with your fist clenched up. It's usually a thing that most people would not necessarily appreciate. For both angles, both the officer or the inmate will not necessarily feel comfortable with that.
So typically, do you? And I'm just kind of thinking about myself, like how often do I walk with my fist clenched? When you see people, do you typically try to keep your hands open and in front of you?
I usually like to keep my hands visible. I expect to also, if I was in front of inmates, that they're doing the same, right? So for example, that I can see their hands. Sometimes because of aggression, of course, because there is an inherent risk, but also because sometimes they would make use of that opportunity. So for example, to sexually assault whoever they're talking to. So for example, through exhibiting or showing their private parts. So if I can see your hands, then am I to assume or to conclude that you have your hands on your privates because you're masturbating, because you're preparing for a sexual assault? So for example, throwing semen at the individual or urine. So sometimes that could be the case. So I feel much more comfortable when I can see the hands of any person, really. But in reality, with an inmate population, it would be important.
What are some nonverbal behaviors that stand out when prisoners communicate with each other?
Something that stood out to me when I first started working in a prison is that some inmates will try to purposely learn sign language or to come up with their own sign language because many individuals are not familiar with the American Sign Language in general, just as a general rule, to keep things secret, or because maybe they're not necessarily trying to keep something secret, but they're in the next cell, so across the whole building. So I can see you, you can't see me, but perhaps you can't hear me. So that's another reason that they will communicate like that. They will either develop their own sign language almost, or they will purposely make it a point to learn sign language.
I imagine that there's rules on eye contact, like staring or prolonged, like visual eye contact considered aggressive or a threat.
I think that it depends on the context. So, for example, something that I made a point of was to look at the gentleman in the eyes, refer to them as sir or as mister, and show them that I am paying attention to them. Because oftentimes inmates don't get respect, but they expect respect. So if you look at them while they're talking to you, sometimes, at least in the prison population where I was working, is seen as a sign of respect. Whereas sometimes a lot of other individuals may not necessarily look at them even when they're talking to them. So that may be seen as disrespectful. So I did make it a point, especially because I'm working in the area of mental health, to show them that there is empathy and there is a level of respect.
And it might be different for you since you're not like a correctional officer, but to express sympathy or empathy can also be seen as disrespectful.
I think it depends on how we define empathy and respect. Sometimes the inmate is actually looking for that, especially, for example, they've been denied parole. They know they're going to be there the rest of their lives. Maybe they just attempted suicide. And a lot of individuals will say, well, they become prosecutors then and say, well, that's the consequence of their crime. But in the empathetic sense, the average person would become upset should they know they're spending the rest of their lives in prison. So at least empathizing with that specific sentiment may actually not necessarily be seen as weakness, but rather this person respects me as a human being, irrespective of what type of crime they might have been convicted of that led to the prison sentence. They may see this person is at least recognizing that I am suffering over this situation. Whether it's warranted or not, that is not within the limits of what a mental health practitioner should be concerned about. Because part of our concern is providing unconditional positive regard. We used to call that, back when I was an undergrad student, we used to call that unconditional love. Part of our job, if I become a prosecutor or a judge to my patients, then how much of a good service can I provide to them? So empathy might not necessarily be seen as a weakness. However, I would say perhaps amongst inmates, it might be seen as a weakness. But between inmate and staff or inmate and correctional officer, I think that could perhaps not be seen as a weakness. Now, within the prison population, I could come up with a hypothesis to say that may be the case, that it would be seen as a weakness.
What are some misconceptions or stereotypes you think exist around like prisoner communication?
That a lot of inmates are educated, and that because of their lack of education, that they're not able to communicate a message. While it is true that there is some relationship between level of education and the likelihood that the person is going to be imprisoned, that doesn't necessarily mean that this gentleman cannot communicate his feelings. Thing is, most of them, given the chance, I should say, to even communicate their feelings in the first place, because they are in prison. And the only acceptable communication of feelings is anger. So when given the chance to, I'm not here to judge you in any way, right? Because I am a mental health provider, for example. If I'm a mental health provider and I'm not here to judge you, it actually stuns them. And people think that they're incapable, I should say, of showing any other feelings other than anger. Inmates are still human beings. They have the same biological factors as you and I do. So clearly they have the same ability to feel and express the same emotions. It's that a lot of the times they might not even know how to express them, but it's not because they're uneducated. It might be a matter of you could be the first time that they talk to a mental health provider. They've never had the chance to talk to anybody about whichever presenting issue they may have.
One thing I was kind of interested in talking about was tattoos as emblems. Prison tattoos happen. Are there certain things that mean anything, or do they wear them as like an identifier?
Generally, prisons will have allocated intelligence department, which is really similar to it's immensely similar to what I used to do in the military because I was intelligence myself. So prisons really do have their own intelligence department in which they investigate matters, for example, of is there potential riots, gang affiliation. So part of that is to identify potential gang affiliations. And some tattoos can be used to identify gang association. And they're also used to find extremist groups. So for example, terroristic, or say for instance, white supremacy, the Brotherhood, KKK. Southern Brotherhood being an extremist group here in the South. Right? So yes, they could be used for that. Some people to use their tattoos to communicate the passing of a loved one or the murder of someone or because of gang affiliation. So there is a whole department allocated to understand what types of affiliations we could determine based on tattoos. And that could also pose a security risk. So for example, individuals who share this tattoo perhaps shouldn't be housed together. So that could pose as a security risk for everybody, other inmates, staff, and officers. It is important. Photographs are taken of the individuals and their tattoos whenever they are imprisoned. So it is in common practice to identify them.
I know we talked about the clenched fists, but would you say that there's any other type of nonverbal communicator of what triggers interactions, violent interactions?
Having intense eye contact, but there is no social interaction going on. So for example, I'm not walking past you and say, good morning, Mr. So-and-so, and you would expect to look at that person. But sometimes when no interaction has occurred whatsoever, and this person looking and staring could, at least in my experience, could be a prelude to a potential sexual exposure. So for example, gauging my behavior or observing, say for example, because I am a female, a biological female, that the person would use that as a means to sexualize the staff member so that they can engage in masturbation or exposure of their genitals to the individual. So I have noticed that if there is an overwhelming amount of attention being given to the individual, not even saying a word, if the person is just looking at you extensively, then it's almost like they're gathering their own intelligence, right? They're doing their own reconnaissance. It could be because of a sexual interest or maybe an attack. So for example, seeing if you have a pen, do you have a radio, do you have comfortable shoes in which you can take off and run? So looking at an individual can also be a way for them to gather intelligence and say, well, she's wearing uncomfortable shoes. Chances are she couldn't run away. She has a radio, she doesn't have a radio, right? So that type of, is she wearing a ponytail? Is she not wearing a ponytail? So just gauging the individual, just like gathering intelligence, basically.